Along the slow rivers, where reeds hissed in the wind and mud, kept the fingerprints of builders. The first cities rose like low islands of baked clay, and on their roofs a quiet idea took shape, that the gods had left instructions hidden in the grain of the world, and that those who learned to read mud, star, number, and name could coax a dangerous order from the restless floodplain. They called their land the land of Sumer, and their gods were not distant abstractions, but patrons who inhabited brick shrines stitched to the ground with copper pins. And it was said that these patrons possessed a treasury of essences, the invisible blueprints of civilization, a chest of powers known as the Me, catalogs of music and sex, kingship and truth, weaving and war, each with a fragrance and a weight that the initiated could sense like a pressure behind the eyes. At Eridu, the oldest of their sacred mounds, a temple rose over a pool where sweet water trembled just beneath the earth. The Abzu, imagined as a vast reservoir of potential, waiting to be portioned into canals. And here the god of cunning and fresh water, lord of language and craft, held court in a house that was a lesson in itself, for its walls wrapped around a source that could bless or drown with equal calm. Stories told of a night when those Me were not simply in one place, but on the move, spirited along a canal by a goddess with a hunger for cities. And while the tale reads like a festival in motion, behind it lurks a blueprint for power, a memory of how knowledge migrates, how arts and offices attach themselves to capitals, how a god's district expands by reassigning the curriculum of civilization. Their kings were introduced not as inventors, but as caretakers of something already arranged. And when Sumerian scribes traced the lines of dynasties in wet clay, they began with a formula that carried both comfort and threat, the notice that kingship descended from the sky, meaning that the right to build levees and levy troops was a kind of meteorological event dressed as policy. They also kept a more disturbing ledger, a list of rulers who reigned before a flood that washed the slate so clean it gleamed, reigns that stretched for absurd lengths like shadows at sunset. And the oddness was not a mistake, but a message, that before the break in history, everything was measured by a different yardstick, a yardstick some claimed still existed in a sealed chamber somewhere under the dust. Out of such chambers came the apkallu, the sage figures of the oldest memory, fish-cloaked teachers who wandered cities before the waters rose, delivering the disciplines that tied villages into cities and cities into a net, teaching brick recipe and boundary law, canal geometry and hymn structure, the grammar of an urban life that would either discipline the river or be ripped by it. Cuneiform grew out of that grammar, the way sedges grow out of a marsh, first as marks that captured cattle and jars, then as marks that captured sounds. And in the schoolhouse courtyards, called tablet houses, boys learned lists with a rigor that looks like faith, reciting trees and birds, gods and tools, measures and months. The entire visible world skimmed into columns that promised control if you could keep up. The Me, those essences, were listed not just as marketable skills, but as traits that had a moral scent, the sweetness of justice beside the bite of kingship, the seduction of song beside the disruption of riot, as if the city itself admitted that everything necessary to live was also dangerous to use, and that the gods had distributed not breezes, but blades wrapped in silk. On the ziggurats that climbed in careful steps into hot sky, the priesthood watched not just the stars, but the behavior of the gods in the streets, noting when omens appeared on fields and in dreams, because the hidden teachings were not solely about how to bake bricks or count sheep. They were about how to recognize the temperament of power as it leaned over a city without speaking. Each temple was a named machine, Anna for the goddess of desire and war, Ikor for the mountain of air, Iabzu for the watery wisdom that cooled the soil, and each machine ran on offerings, decrees, and remembrances. The entire network humming with a belief that rituals tuned the world like a harp, and that tuning was a curriculum that could be lost if a reed pen failed to copy a line. Clay cones stamped with dedicatory lines were driven into walls, like prayers nailed to a spine. Foundation tablets were buried under thresholds like time capsules with a nervous purpose. And as officials pressed their seals into wet surfaces, the city sealed itself to an agreement that stretched backward to unremembered mornings and forward to nights that had not yet been catalogued. Somewhere under broken bricks and hard salt, archaeologists have found rooms with channels cut into their floors. Rooms where the smell of water must have mixed with incense. And reading the fragments left there, you sense a confidence wrapped in anxiety. The belief that the gods had shown the way to harness a swamp and found a kingdom, paired with the suspicion that if one step of the dance were forgotten, the river would close its generous fingers. Even now, when the wind slides over the flatlands and lifts pale dust from the edges of old canals, you can feel how a city might hear that hiss as a warning, a whisper that asks whether the hidden teachings have been kept clean or whether they have been smudged, and the question still seems to come from the pool beneath the oldest temple where the water waits. In the story that survives like a lamp in a damp cellar, a goddess leaves a house of wisdom with barge loads of civilization, items that read like a visitor's guide and an indictment at once, and the list itself is a revelation. Because among the me is courage and truth and the art of numbers, but there is also deceit, strife, and the disquieting gift of the sacred tavern, an admission that order cannot exist without its shadows attached. The tale is festive on the surface, a journey by torchlight down a canal with music bouncing off reeds, yet the undertow is political. For when these essences reach a new city, monuments rise as if by oath, beasts of stone take their places at gates, scribal schools erupt in courtyards, and the voice of the god shifts neighborhood, which is a softer way of saying the center of gravity moves. Elsewhere, a separate strand coils around a different object, the Tablet of Destinies, a dangerous plaque said to anchor the authority of decrees by making them coextensive with reality. And whether it hung in the hall of air or in the satchel of a stormbird for a while, its custody mattered, because whoever wore or guarded it did not just announce fate, they printed it. When one reads the accounts of that tablet seized and recovered, or sees reliefs of a warrior returning a stolen emblem to its place, the narrative carries a subtext about archives and control, for if the sky runs on script, then script must be guarded like a reservoir, and the standing of an entire pantheon can tilt because a sign with lines on it has moved from one set of hands to another. These myths anchored practices that at first glance seem bureaucratic but hum with awe, such as when scribes copied omen catalogs that paired anomalies with outcomes in long sequences of if and then, a technology that made the world legible enough to answer. And behind the logic lies an older intuition that the gods published a syllabus that could be learned with sufficient discipline. In the schoolrooms of Nippur, aspirants rehearsed not revolutions, but lists, lexica of trees, fish, stones, tablets of synonyms, proverbs grown smooth by handling, and the patience required to pass through that gauntlet trained a class of interpreters who could serve as technicians of meaning, flipping clay leaves as kings waited for a favorable phrase to stabilize a risky harvest or a risky war. The me also explained intimacy between divine and human tasks in a way that rationalizes power while admitting fragility. And nowhere is that thread more revealing and in the rite of sacred union performed at the turn of the year, a symbolic night in which a mortal body enacts the romance of god and goddess so the fields will consent to ripen, a choreography that insists the health of the state can hinge on tenderness as much as on grain tax. Canals, too, carry theology beneath their shimmer. For a city that calls fresh water, the body of a god turns irrigation maps into hymns and legal codes into incantations. And when officials set standards for the lengths of dikes or the volume measures of grain, they are not merely doing math. They are conforming to an unseen measuring line that the gods are imagined to hold tight in the sky. That line appears in art as a rod and ring lowered toward kings, a symbolic measuring cord and rule offered in visions to inaugurate building and boundary. And the meaning is as precise as it is mysterious. That sovereignty is a license to measure weight and field, to align walls and seasons, to keep the city's grid in step with a divine survey that predated brick. In the early wisdom literature, a father advises a son on conduct and craft, and the plots offered there are as sharp as any watertight canal. Instructions not to tear boundary markers, not to trust the gusts of gossip, not to expand a field at a neighbor's expense, the ethical reflection of a hydraulic economy where lines mean life, and the tone implies a teaching inherited from deities by way of marsh-reared sages. Sargon of Akkad later rings the horizon with conquest and prefaces his feats with a story of origins on a river, a life lifted from water to a palace by fate's soft hand. And such narratives are not simply flattery, but signal a resorting of the divine curriculum, a claim that a new capital has enrolled itself in the hidden program and now holds the Yao binder where the Mi are indexed and available to dispense. When empires shift, hymns are edited with an expertise that looks legalistic, older themes refitted to newer courts, and the continuity that results is both faithful and audacious, preserving the appearance of unbroken teaching while redirecting traffic from one temple to another. And such textual engineering is itself a Mi, an art of revision cloaked as conservation. Where the texts fall silent, bricks speak, and the bricks say that rituals followed schedules keyed to something larger than policy, that festivals occurred in step with appearances of stars no one dared to ignore, and that the city's drama was part of a curriculum whose author might withhold grace if the lines were not acted correctly. Always there is the sense that beyond the visible tablet, a second one lies, a master copy in the mind of the gods that no human hand can smear. And the fear that keeps the stylus sharp is the fear of deviating from that unseen page, a fear that keeps a society attentive long after the songs have become familiar. The most unsettling of the old instructions are bound to a descent, a stripping and a return, a passage through the country without return that functions like a masterclass in the cost of power. For when a goddess who had gathered the curriculum of civilization chooses to visit the depths, she is relieved of each emblem at each gate until only a naked premise persists. 7 gates and 7 losses give a rhythm to that crossing, and in the language of priestly robes and city jewelry, one can read a rehearsal of humility, the understanding that, to confront the absolute, one must arrive as a body without office. And this is not a moral parable alone, but an agricultural one. For the stripping and return rhyme with fields that fall quiet and then clothe themselves again by agreement. Her re-emergence is bought with a substitution, and the way the myth measures that exchange suggests a truth hidden in plain sight. That society buys springtime with winter's accounting, that abundance is financed by a shortfall carried by someone else, that power is never without a ledger, and the entire year becomes a conversation between loss and relief, that scribes tried to keep balanced. The lesson is not purely seasonal, for the descent maps the eerie logic of initiation, the idea that those who would hold the measuring line must pass through a corridor where their own measures fail, and that after such a passage the returned person is a bridge between worlds, tolerated because they remember rules the living usually forget until rules are enforced sharply. Just as calendars are broken into levies against chaos, weights and measures emerge as instruments of grace disguised as bureaucracy, and the rod and rings seen in reliefs imply a social geometry as rigorous as any star map, a reminder that surveying is a sacrament when marshland can erase monuments in a night unless levies meet precisely in the morning fog. At Nippur, where the mountain of air held a court that handled both weather and law, the allocation of fates could be imagined as a kind of docket, and the files that crossed that table were not only destinies of kings, but the continuance of daily procedures, the liturgies that kept ovens hot and granaries honest. And the invisible teaching is that justice is a maintenance art, not a lightning bolt. Dreams were engineered in chambers, where bodies lay on mats, listening for a god's breath as it stirred curtains. A technology of sleep that turned temples into clinics where meaning could be harvested carefully, and the reports that emerged became entries in growing catalogs that married meteorological oddity to political caution. Animal levers were read as if the city's consent to continue were written in the sheen of an organ. And while that method looks foreign to modern reason, its structure is familiar. A training program with models, a visualization exercise, a simulation of decision-making where the stakes were high enough that proxies stood in for the unmanageable whole. The same seriousness attached to scribal training, where boys learned foreign signs as part of their ascent. For in the age when imperial tongues layered over the older speech, the academy became a bilingual gate where the old gods learned new names and the old me were translated into forms that preserved their sharp edges even as political maps spread different colors. Libraries were not public rooms with chairs, but sealed recesses with walls that remembered the touch of every tablet. And when later kings built their own archives, they assembled copies like a nervous man assembles keys, knowing that knowledge can leak over centuries unless the doors are latched and the content braided tightly into liturgies that keep it walking. Excavators have uncovered rooms where shelves collapsed and clay slid like a slow avalanche. And among the shards, one finds traces of incantations that balanced on the grammar of the world like gymnasts on a line. Instructions for laying a foundation during an unlucky month, or moving an idol when the wind argued. And the lines are at once practical and enchanted. Somewhere in those rooms, the memory of the flood is kept like a stone wrapped in wool, a rich object no longer in use, but too heavy to discard. And when the word for that memory surfaces in a prayer or a decree, it triggers an older posture in a listener's spine, the crouch of someone who knows that all their wall building is an essay in delaying the inevitable. The descent teaches that inevitability is not the same as surrender, and the secret buried in the rise and fall of gods and goddesses is not that humans are powerless, but that power is collaborative, that the city survives where rituals align with water, weather, and will, and that the hidden teaching is not arcana, but attention dressed in divine clothing. The oldest cities remembered teachers whose forms were more than human, advisors whose cloak looked like a fish, and whose head wore a crown with the calm of someone who had seen a world drown and refloat. And the teachings they left behind, concentrated in the arts, that keep mud from flowing back into undifferentiated marsh, brick bond, wall batter, canal grade, and sentence structure that does not dissolve. After the flood washed the calendar clean, human scholars took the place of fish-cloaked visitors in the official stories, but the titles of their offices still bore a shimmer: Master of Secrets, Chief of the Ritual House, Keeper of the Tablet Chest, and in those offices the continuity of instruction survived political weather, which is itself a quiet miracle with teeth. Eridu Genesis whispers through damaged clay of a righteous builder, cued by a warning that threads through a wall like a low wind. A man asked to box the world into a boat for a while and store its seeds, and nestled inside the roar of rain is the domestic detail that the gods, too, require feeding and attention, or they become less attentive, a dangerous reciprocity formalized into liturgy. Another figure refuses a meal that would have made his years continue beyond accounting, a decision framed as safety yet felt as loss, and the lesson that ripples from that refusal is that the gods kept immortality as a private reserve, offering humans a consolation prize called civilization, whose currencies are literacy, craft, and law, a compensation that only works if maintained by practice. Law codes appear in this light not as sudden pillars, but as the ossification of older streams of advice, cleansed of proverbs sigh and set into declarative voice on monuments planted where disputes brew. And the reliefs that accompany these inscriptions are as didactic as they are ornamental, a ruler receiving the instruments of measurement from the seated presence of a god whose gaze does not flicker. Measuring is therefore not mere math, but a trance of fairness. And in a land where each misdrawn line can divert a river into a neighbor's harvest, the justice imagined is watery, flowing along channels cut by deliberation and checked by ritual, as if the courts themselves were machines built to drain swamp from the heart of a crowded street. When capitals shifted and a new city inherited the throne, the old gods were not dismissed so much as transferred, their biographies edited to match a new dialect, their powers resorted into portfolios that favored the new regime. And the cynic hears this and smiles. But the devotee hears continuity, because the hidden teaching insists that names can change while functions persist. The Tablet of Destinies migrates again into new myth cycles, where a dragon-battered champion takes custody of its clauses, and it becomes plain that the object is a metaphor with real policies attached, since kings used the ideology of fixed decree to hold tight their cities, while scribes used the ideology of consultation to keep that grip from cracking the brick, and the tension is what made the system sing. In reliefs cut centuries after the first reeds were turned into writing, fish-cloaked figures still sprinkle water from a pinnacone over the tree of life, while holding a small bucket whose name means wisdom condensed, an image of constant maintenance that compresses a temple's entire job into a gesture. And that gesture says the world needs dusting daily to keep oblivion from nesting in its corners. What passes as magic in these texts is often engineering, wearing a gown of starlight, incantations that specify the number of knots to tie, the measure of oil to pour, the kinds of wood that resist the moods of weather, the positions of hands when placing a cornerstone under a sky whose mood has been diagnosed, and the observed result is a city that stands longer than its materials should allow. Libraries were sometimes tucked into royal houses as trophies of empire, the most famous assembled by an ambitious king who copied ancient texts like a man rushing to catch the last boat. But that collection is a late echo of earlier caches in temple corners, and the practice that built them all was a suspicion that the main channel of teaching can silt without private tributaries feeding it quietly at night. The hidden teaching inside all these hidden teachings is a structural humility, the admission that human systems are scaffolds erected against bigger weather, and that the gods, in their stories, practice and punish that humility with a severity softened only by song, a severity that trained generations to make a living agreement with land, wind, water, and one another. On a ruined terrace under a thin crescent, a carved king holds out his hand to touch the loop and rod that gleam like coiled river and straight canal, and the relief suggests an exchange as quiet as breath, an oath without words that in return for the right to measure, the king will keep the measures clean, and that promise feels like the oldest contract carved into stone. At twilight in a city whose bricks bake beneath forgotten sandals, the wind still lifts dust in a way that outlines patterns, and the old curriculum announces itself in those patterns like a low chant, not to show off but to test, for the hidden teachings were never hidden to exclude. They were hidden to require attention, and attention is the price of survival when river and sky combine. In the ritual houses where apprentices copied until their wrists ached, the shelves carried not only chronicles of kings, but handbooks with careful diagrams and strange call, lists of demons that are really names for failures, lists of remedies that are really engineering solutions. And all along, the insistence that language itself can be a lever if focused long enough on a stubborn piece of world. There is a word that describes the glow around divinity, a mantle of presence that buzzes like heat, and when statues were washed, clothed, and fed with offerings, the washing and clothing were not make-believe but maintenance of that charged skin that allows the god to continue functioning in the city, a belief that reveals how sophisticated the theology of upkeep became when every neglected hinge could become an omen. Buried beneath thresholds and in the chests of corner rooms, foundation deposits waited like sleeping oaths, inscribed with wishes that the house stand, the wall remain alert, the gate never forget to swing, and the writing is addressed to gods as much as to time, a sign that the stewards of the cities taught themselves to plant sentences as deep as stones. Laments survived the fall of great walls and soft palaces, whose music drifted into the steppe, and in those laments the voice that weeps is a city's own, mourning the day its patron left the temple, the night its ovens cooled, the morning its fishermen returned with empty nets. And carried in that sorrow is instruction for rebuilding, a liturgy that maps grief into task lists. Even the Omen series that looks so severe hide a surprising tenderness, for to assign meaning to an eclipse is to refuse panic its full claim, and to prescribe a ritual in answer to a comet is to teach a town to breathe in unison when the sky brings news in a sharpened tone, a social technology that keeps fear braided into duty instead of laying it fray into disorder. In every story where gods reshape the curriculum to favor a capital, one can sense the double act of preservation and erasure, a conspiracy of the pious and the pragmatic to keep the thread unbroken while pulling it through a new loom. And the reader of such edits learns to detect where old powers have been renamed, where heritages have not vanished, but have been lifted into other masks. The me still travel when capitals change, though we now call them sciences and arts, law and irrigation engineering, architecture and music, writing and computation, and they are as perilous as ever. For any art strong enough to feed a city can starve it if distributed without care, a lesson the earliest scribes would have recognized when they recorded both festivals and finds. If the hidden teaching has a final glint, it is this, that immortality was replaced by continuity, that instead of living forever, the cities agreed to keep living together by copying lines with exactness and setting walls in alignment and rehearsing songs until forgetting was a kind of sin. And the deal, while cold, is beautiful, because it built mornings where none should have returned. On nights when the moon slips through gauze and the canal edges gleam as if fed from below by a submerged light. One can believe the old pool under Eridu still breathes, releasing instruction in bubbles no one has read yet, sending up syllables that teach a new practice for a new dryness. And the world waits, as it always has, for someone to listen with ancient ears. The gods in these stories are not bosses so much as narrations of necessity, personifications of the work that must be done daily, lest the city return to river. And to call their counsel hidden is only to say that they demand patience before they will speak. And patience is a liturgy we can still rehearse when the earth dries and the sky hardens. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.